The clock on J. Edgar Hoover's wall read 11:47 p.m. The FBI building was supposed to be empty. Security guards had been mysteriously reassigned. The director of America's most powerful law enforcement agency sat alone in his office, hands folded, waiting. When the knock came, soft and deliberate, Hoover didn't flinch. He'd been expecting it. The door opened without permission. In walked a man who'd never stepped foot in this building. A man the FBI had spent 15 years trying to destroy. Bumpy Johnson, 56 years old, dressed in a midnight blue suit, his fedora casting shadows across a face that had seen everything. Hoover looked up from his desk and, for the first time in decades, smiled genuinely. "Right on time," Hoover said. "Please, sit." Bumpy didn't sit. He walked to the window overlooking Pennsylvania Avenue, hands clasped behind his back. "Nice view. You can see the whole city from here." "Every inch," Hoover replied, "including Harlem." What happened in the next 2 hours wasn't just a conversation. It was the birth of the most dangerous alliance in American criminal history. An alliance so secret that even today, 60 years later, the files remain classified. But the consequences, they shaped every major organized crime takedown for the next 20 years. To understand why the most powerful white man in America was secretly meeting with the most powerful black man in the underworld, you need to understand what J. Edgar Hoover was facing in 1963. The Italian Mafia had grown beyond his control. Lucky Luciano's modernized Cosa Nostra had infiltrated politics, unions, and even law enforcement. 5 families controlled New York. Chicago was owned by the outfit, and every major city had its own crew. But there was one neighborhood in New York where the Italians couldn't gain a foothold: Harlem, and the man who kept them out was standing in Hoover's office, calm as Sunday morning. October 14th, 1963. 3 weeks before this midnight meeting, FBI Special Agent Robert McKinnon had delivered a report to Hoover that changed everything. McKinnon had spent 2 years infiltrating mob operations, and what he discovered terrified the Bureau. The 5 families weren't just running numbers and loan sharking anymore. They were planning something unprecedented. Director McKinnon had said, spreading photographs across Hoover's desk. "They're going after federal operations, customs, IRS, even us. They want to own the government." The photographs showed meetings between mob bosses and federal officials, secret handshakes, briefcases full of cash, signatures on documents that should never have been signed. Carlo Gambino had judges in his pocket. Frank Costello was paying senators. Vito Genovese had turned 3 FBI agents. But here's what shook Hoover to his core. In every single photograph, in every meeting, in every corruption scheme, one neighborhood was conspicuously absent: Harlem. The families controlled everything except the one place where America's most wanted black man held court. That's when Hoover made a calculation that would define his legacy. If you can't beat them, use someone who already has. The meeting had been arranged through Father Callahan at St. Philip's Church. The old priest had been passing messages between unlikely allies for 30 years. He delivered Hoover's invitation personally, walking into Small's Paradise on a Thursday night, approaching Bumpy's table and whispering 7 words: "The director would like to buy you dinner." Bumpy had studied the priest's face for a long moment, then smiled. "Tell him I don't eat with strangers, but I'll talk business." Now, standing in the FBI director's office, Bumpy finally turned away from the window. "You wanted to talk, so talk." Hoover opened a file folder, pulled out a single photograph, and slid it across the desk. It showed Vito Genovese shaking hands with a federal judge outside a Manhattan courthouse. "Recognize him?" Bumpy glanced at the photo. "Judge Morrison, good man. Shame he's taking dirty money." "He's not the only one." Hoover pulled out more photographs. Senators, customs officials, police commissioners, all with Italian mobsters. "They're buying the government piece by piece. In 5 years, they'll own every major federal agency." Bumpy picked up one of the photographs, studied it closely. "What's this got to do with me?" "You're the only one they haven't bought," Hoover said quietly. "You're the only one they can't buy." It was true. For 30 years, the Italians had tried everything to penetrate Harlem. They'd sent enforcers. Bumpy sent them back in ambulances. They'd offered partnerships. Bumpy told them Harlem wasn't for sale. They'd attempted hostile takeovers. Dutch Schultz ended up dead in a Newark restaurant. So you want me to what? Exactly, Bumpy asked. Hoover leaned forward. I want you to keep doing what you're doing. Keep them out of Harlem, but I also want you to do something else. He paused, weighing his next words carefully. I want you to help me destroy them. The silence that followed was absolute. Bumpy set the photograph down, walked back to the window, and stared out at the city lights. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. You're asking me to work for the FBI. I'm asking you to work with the FBI, Hoover corrected. There's a difference. Not to my people. There ain't. Hoover stood up, walked around his desk, and joined Bumpy at the window. For a moment, two of America's most powerful men stood side by side, looking out at the same city from very different perspectives. Let me tell you what happens if we don't stop them, Hoover said. In 5 years, the Italians will control every federal agency. They'll decide which laws get enforced, which criminals get prosecuted, which politicians get elected. They'll own America. He turned to face Bumpy. Including Harlem. Bumpy's jaw tightened. Harlem's not theirs to own. It will be if they control the FBI, the IRS, the DEA. They'll flood your neighborhood with enough federal agents to turn it into a police state. They'll arrest every black leader who stands up to them. They'll destroy everything you've built. It was a masterful manipulation. Hoover was offering Bumpy a choice. Work with the devil you know, or watch the devil you don't know. Take everything. Bumpy was quiet for a long time. Then what kind of help are you talking about? Hoover returned to his desk, pulled out a thick folder, and opened it. Inside were surveillance photos, wiretap transcripts, financial records, an entire catalog of Italian mob operations. Intelligence, Hoover said. The Italians think you're just another street criminal. They don't know you have a network that reaches into every corner of this city. You see things we can't see. You hear things we can't hear. You know things we can't know. He pulled out a specific photograph. It showed Carlo Gambino entering a restaurant on Mulberry Street. This was taken 3 days ago. Gambino was meeting with someone. We don't know who. Our surveillance was blocked, but your people, my people, were in that restaurant. Bumpy finished. Exactly. Bumpy studied the photograph. He knew exactly what meeting this was. Gambino had been planning to move into the heroin trade, using Marseille connections to import directly from Turkey. But Bumpy's informants had told him something else. Gambino was also planning to use that heroin to flood Harlem, create an epidemic that would destroy the community from within. What do I get out of this? Bumpy asked. Protection, Hoover said immediately. Full federal protection. No more arrests for policy violations. No more raids on your establishments. Complete. It was an incredible offer. Bumpy had been dodging federal cases for 20 years. With Hoover's protection, he could operate freely, expand his empire, protect his people without looking over his shoulder. But there was something else. Hoover pulled out one final document, and this. It was a federal program proposal, community investment, job training, youth programs, all targeted at Harlem, all funded by the federal government, all administered by community leaders. You want to help your people, Hoover said. This is how you do it. Not with gambling money, with legitimate federal funding. Schools, clinics, businesses. You can build something that lasts. Bumpy stared at the document for a long time. It was everything he'd ever wanted for Harlem. Real opportunity, real investment, real change. But the price was becoming an informant against his own kind of people. Even if those people were Italian, not black, it still meant betraying the criminal code he'd lived by for 30 years. I need to think about this, Bumpy said. You have 48 hours, Hoover replied. After that, we move forward without you. It was a veiled threat. If Bumpy didn't cooperate, the FBI would find other ways to take down the Italians, ways that might involve turning Harlem into a battlefield. Bumpy walked toward the door, then stopped. You know what's funny about all this? What's that? You spent 15 years trying to put me in prison. Now you want to make me your partner. Hoover smiled coldly. Politics makes strange bedfellows. "This ain't politics," Bumpy said. "This is survival." 2 days later, Bumpy Johnson made his decision, not at another secret meeting, but through a public action that sent a clear message to anyone watching. October 16th, 1963, Vincent the Chin Gigante, one of Genovese's top lieutenants, was arrested while trying to enter a Harlem numbers bank. The arrest was surgical, precise, based on intelligence that could only have come from someone with intimate knowledge of both the operation and Gigante's movements. The newspapers reported it as routine police work. But every mobster in New York understood the real message. Someone in Harlem was feeding information to the authorities, someone with access, credibility, and power. The Italian families called emergency meetings. They suspected everyone, trusted no one. Their paranoia became their weakness. They started making mistakes, leaving trails, exposing themselves, and every mistake was reported back to J. Edgar Hoover through channels so secret that even today, the FBI won't acknowledge they existed. Over the next 5 years, this invisible partnership devastated organized crime in New York. The Genovese family was dismantled. The Gambinos went underground. The Lucheses fled to New Jersey. The Colombos turned on each other. The Bonanos disappeared entirely. But the price was steep. Bumpy Johnson had become something he never wanted to be, a federal informant, not against his own people, but against the criminal code that had defined his life. He'd traded his soul for his community's future, and it worked. Federal money flowed into Harlem. Schools were built, clinics opened, job programs launched. For the first time since Reconstruction, Black residents had access to real federal resources. The community that had been abandoned by America was finally getting investment. But Bumpy knew the cost. Every night, he sat in his apartment above Small's Paradise, looking out at the streets he'd protected for 30 years, wondering if he'd made a deal with the right devil. Father Callahan visited him often during those years. The old priest had been the conduit for the unholy alliance, and he understood the weight Bumpy carried. "Do you regret it?" the priest asked one evening in 1967. Bumpy was quiet for a long time. "I did what I had to do to protect my people." "That's not what I asked." Bumpy turned away from the window. "Every morning, I wake up, I see those Italian boys who went to prison because of information I gave Hoover, their families, their kids. They weren't all bad men, but they were part of a bad system. So am I now." The priest had no answer for that, because Bumpy was right. He'd become part of a system that used people, manipulated them, discarded them when they were no longer useful. The only difference was that this time, his community had benefited. J. Edgar Hoover died in 1972, taking the secrets of his alliance with Bumpy Johnson to his grave. The files remain classified. The programs launched in Harlem were quietly defunded. The federal protection evaporated. But for 9 years, from 1963 to 1972, one of America's most wanted criminals and America's most powerful law enforcement officer worked together to reshape organized crime in New York City. The Italian Mafia never recovered from the systematic dismantling of the 1960s. They lost their political connections, their federal protection, their ability to operate with impunity. The 5 families became shadows of their former selves. And Harlem, for 9 precious years, it had something no other Black community in America had: federal investment, protection, and opportunity. Schools that worked, programs that lifted families out of poverty, hope, whether it was worth the cost, whether trading the criminal code for community progress was justified, history will debate forever. But one thing is certain: sometimes the most dangerous alliances are the ones nobody sees coming. The night even the FBI didn't know became the secret that changed America. 2 men who should have been enemies became partners in pursuit of their own version of justice, and for better or worse, they succeeded. October 14th, 1963, J. Edgar Hoover's office, 11:47 p.m. The meeting that never officially happened. The alliance that officially never existed. The secret that's still classified 60 years later. Because some truths are too dangerous for history books, Some partnerships are too complex for public understanding. Some alliances require darkness to survive. Bumpy Johnson and J. Edgar Hoover understood this perfectly. They made their deal in shadows because shadows were the only place where their kind of justice could exist. The files remain locked. The truth remains buried. But the consequences of that midnight meeting shaped American organized crime for generations. That's the power of secrets. That's the price of progress. That's the weight of choices made in rooms where history isn't recorded, only lived. And sometimes, in those darkest moments, enemies become allies, criminals become patriots, and the impossible becomes inevitable. The night even the FBI didn't know, the alliance even history couldn't record, the secret that changed everything.